All right. Well, I am excited to be here with you. Just in the way of introduction, I am Lorana Hughes, and I currently live in Cuenca, Ecuador. And today, I am going to be talking about my experience visiting the Pumapungo Museum. That's one of the history museums here in Ecuador. And I'm going to be pulling up my notes. This is the first time that I've done this with the notes attached to it. So thank you in advance for your patience with me and the technology. Is everybody, those of you that came in late or came in after I gave the opening, if you would let us know where you are visiting us from today. I saw Morgantown, North Carolina, Iowa, South Carolina, and Almaty, Kazakhstan. That is a new city. I see Boston, Massachusetts, and I see Arkansas. Glad to have you all with us today. And I am really excited about this because this is one of the explorations as I learn more about the culture of Cuenca. And so I want to welcome you to the virtual field trip today of the Pumapungo Museum, which is located in the beautiful city of Cuenca, Ecuador. And so this evening, we'll be embarking on a tour that will be rich in cultural heritage of Ecuador. I'll be focusing on some of the exhibits and the artifacts that are housed at the museum here in Cuenca, Ecuador today. The picture that you see in the screen is of a beautiful cathedral, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception here in downtown Cuenca, one of the sites that you will see on many of the things that talk about Cuenca. And today, our field trip is going to take us here to the museum, the Pumapungo Museum. This museum is situated within the archaeological part of Pumapungo, which was once the heart of an ancient city of Tomibamba, which was a significant pre-Columbian settlement of the Incan Empire. The museum has a collection of artifacts, not only from history, but also from art that are reflective of the culture here. And they span from the time frame of pre-Columbian to the colonial era and beyond to contemporary times. And I've visited this museum several times now, and each time with the changing exhibits as well as the permanent exhibits here, there's quite a bit of insight into the history and the culture and the indigenous people that are from this region. And this is an ethnographic museum. And I began to look that up, and it was about the ethnographic is about the science of people, of the history of people. And I found that very interesting as they begin to weave the story here. But our journey begins with the pre-Columbian era. And it was a time where civilizations such as the Cañari civilization and the Incan people were thriving. And the museum has been able to collect quite a few artifacts that include things like pottery and textiles and ceremonial objects that provide a glimpse into the life and the beliefs and the achievements of these ancient societies. And at the museum, it shares with us that the ethnographic objective, that an object is part of the being of a people. It persists, adapts, and evolves over time when it is conceived to fulfill a social function, solve a transcendent need, or establish relationships between human conglomerates. And so you'll be seeing today some of the collection of those things that I found from the various regions. So we'll start our tour today, and I want to give one just disclaimer on the beginning. Some of the pictures are low light because you're asked at the museum to not use flash photography. And so we were unable to do video and flash photography at the request of the museum. And so we honored that request. So just a disclaimer in advance. And so as we go into some of the artifacts, it talks about things that were a part of their everyday life And it starts with these kinds of things and this display of children's toys and a boat. And I thought these simple things that are recognizable to me even today would be the simple kinds of things that I could see my grandson playing with. The boat with the sails, the animal, maybe a dog, maybe it was on a string with wheels, or the doll with the skirt that's made out of a printed fabric that might have been a scrap of cloth or off of a clothes that had been discarded. And so we see that some of what we see tells us that we're a whole lot alike, even many, many years away, and for some of you, many, many miles away. And as we see some of the other things, we see parts of their culture that are tied to the celebration, that are tied to the rituals, and that are tied to the festivities. And so this is a skull with braids of fiber and of ribbons. And in this culture, even today, one of the things that I find is that even the utilitarian items, things that are useful, whether it be a scarf that's tying a satchel to someone's back with produce as they go to market, or in their movement in and out of the day, I notice that beauty is involved. I'll see individuals with scarves or shawls holding up those baskets of produce on my way to the market, and they'll be sequined and embroidered. And I can't help but realize that part of this is the cultural connection that has continued. We also see some of the everyday kinds of things that really weren't about function in a way of making life work, but instead they were about community. They were about music and about the drums. And you'll see as we walk through the museum today, other artifacts that give reference to the music of the people. Some of the dolls and that are representational of the time, of the period, of the clothes, but also some of the carvings and the pottery. And if you've seen works by indigenous cultures, many of them are representational, the faces of the people that are a part of the culture. And then I want to talk about the different groups of people. Ecuador is a relatively small country that's in South America, located on the Pacific coast, south of Colombia, and north of Peru. And one of the groups that we talk about, one of the groups that are represented in the museum are the Chachis or the Cayapas people. Historical sources refer to the Chachis as Cayapas, but today the term is rarely heard and is sometimes considered offensive. Currently, Chachi is preferred. It's a native name for person and an element of the name of the Chapala language, which is one of the languages which means language of the people. And a little bit about the Chachi or the Cayapas people. They lived in the northern area of Ecuador. As you see on this map, the Esmeraldas is the region just south of the border of Colombia and bordering the Pacific coast. And these people live in the Esmeraldas jungle. And according to the tradition, they're originally from Imbabura, which is a little bit further east into the country. They number approximately 4,000 people. And agriculture is the basis of their livelihood, which is also complemented by fishing and hunting. And in this region, the banana is one of the fundamental foods in various varieties that are available here. The people typically dispersed, although they were still generally in the same region, and they dispersed themselves along the banks of rivers, and sometimes we see them forming small towns. They still to this day preserve the Chapalachi language. And the clothing that you would see, because the various indigenous groups of Ecuador have very different traditions as far as clothing. But the women would typically have on a skirt. It would be fastened with a sash around the waist, kind of like a cummerbund, but with ties. The men would have on a long shirt that was up to the knees. And on special occasions, they would wear colorful necklaces and earrings and belts. Again, the beautiful things that adorn them. Women would also, you'd also see women with decorations in their hair. They also would use things like canoes for their travel up and down the riverways, and oftentimes they would be carved out of a single trunk, and those would be highly valued along the coast. They would not only be safe, but they'd be seaworthy. There are also a people where their basketry is marketed throughout the country, and it's made out of the plant fibers that are found in the area. And typically, basket weaving is women's work. The individuals of this region would typically live in a single room house with a kitchen. They'd have a palm roof of some kind, and usually they'd be raised and on stilts. And so some of the wares from this particular region would be things like these woven bags or baskets. As you can see, oftentimes the patterns are beautiful patterns with different colored fibers, and sometimes fibers that have been dyed, many times with plant coloring. These are some of the other styles of baskets that may be found in this region. And again, practical things within their culture, these would be gourds of some sort that would be used as a scale in the commerce that they carried out. I don't think any of you would wonder what these were used for, but these would be things that are carved out of wood with patterns, but also things that would be just as simple as toy animals. I speculate that these might be the cuy that are eaten here, and I'll let you decide if you're going to Google what cuy really are, but I haven't graduated to tasting them quite yet. But these carvings are reminiscent of that from my experience here. And you can see the simplicity, but yet just the connection with capturing the culture. And then we move on to a people called the Colorados, or the Sachila people. And that's Tsachtchila, Sachila, also known as the Colorados. This group, the ethnicity of around about 1,000 people, and they live in the lower part of the province of Ecuador that's called Pichinche. This would be nearer to the capital of Quito, which is central and north in the country. Their agricultural diet is a little bit different. It's complemented by beef products in the area. And then other staples that are also staples throughout the country would be banana and yuca. Yuca is also called cassava in some countries. And as an American, yuca wasn't something I was familiar with, but upon moving and living in Ecuador, I realized that yuca is the same as tapioca flour. And so if you're not aware of the similarities, yucca and cassava are the same tuberous, starchy food. And so this group of people typically trade in cattle and in fruit coming from that region. And as we look, we see a little bit different in the dress for the people of this area. They also do game hunting and fishing in addition to their trade of cattle and of fruits. They typically also live in dispersed housing. And what you typically will still see today are raised houses In this particular region, they might live in raised houses, but they also may be living in houses that would be constructed on dirt floors in a simple rectangular design with wood or bamboo, the chancha wood on the walls, and palm leaves on a gabled roof. So very simple structures. They have their own language. Taspiki is their language, and it's related to the Chachi language. And the outfit, it's significant in how they wear it. The horizontal stripes, and oftentimes the blue and the white for men, and multicolored, or the tunan would be for women. And so, as you see in this representation, you see the man with the blue and the white striped skirt, and the colorful one would be more what would be worn for a woman. And body painting is something that's very common for this particular tribe of people. They would typically use vegetable dyes, and men would form a kind of red helmet with their hair by using anato. Anato is a plant-based item that's red, and it gives you this bright red, almost a red-brown color, and they would mix that with oil, and that would be used to form the decorative helmet style there on his head.
So
gives you a little bit closer up.
Quick question. I was going to say that's what they do with their hair, because I thought maybe that was a gourd that they hollowed out.
No, that would be their hair. Oof. It would be the anato, which is red and
right,
with
coloring.
oil in it. It's also used in cooking, and it's oftentimes a paste. So it's thick and it's a paste. Think of like pomade.
Yeah, well, I use Saison, like Goya Saison, and that has the anato in it, and that is what makes all your cookware orange.
Yes, indeed.
Cook.
Yes, indeed.
It stains
they
your
sell
spoon.
pure anato in oil here, and it's a thick paste, about the consistency of margarine.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we go on to one of the next region that we're going to talk about, and this would be the Afro-Ecuadorians of the Esmeraldas. Esmeralda, again, is the northern portion of the country, and typically the Afro-Ecuadorians, or what would visibly appear to be Black population in Ecuador, is located mainly in two places in higher concentrations than the rest of the country. And one of those places is in this border of the mountain province of Karachi and Imbabura, and here in the Esmeraldas. There's approximately 80,000 settled in the countryside and in the urban centers of that particular region. Depending on where they live, typically agriculture, fishing, livestock, crafts, and commerce are typical of that region. There's a notable wealth of oral history or oral literature that's transmitted from generation to generation through the stories that they tell. For the Afro-Ecuadorians of the Esmeraldas, music and dance are very important. The imagery of this particular display is reflecting that, the music and the instruments. And oftentimes music and dance accompany great moments in life. Does that sound familiar? After the intervention of Fray Bartolome de las Casas in favor of the Indians at the beginning of the 16th century, numerous Black slaves were introduced to Ecuador to replace the Indians in working in the mines. Cabello del Balboa, the chronicler of the conquest, relates that in the mid-16th century, a galleon ran around the coast of Esmeralda, from which 20 Black Africans who settled in the area fled. There's still holidays about that where there were slaves that were able to escape. And often they would then go into the jungle and be able to live or form community with other tribes that may have been in the jungle as well. Some of the wares, you'll notice a little bit different style in the woven wares that would come out of this particular region. This would be a container for carrying things, utilitarian items. And the patterning of the mat, this would be a rug and a basket with the colored fibers being used to design the patterns. Other types of wares that you may see would be, again, utilitarian. Baskets, things to carry things. And then other items, the pipes and carvings. Carvings of animals typically are things that would be seen routinely. And jewelry. I've talked several times about beauty. This particular one appeared to be made out of coconut shells. It appeared to be a coconut shell that had been carved into pieces and then strung together as jewelry. And then the next group of people that I'd like to share with you on display here was the choclo pescador. And that is the fisherman choclo. And it's called this as a result of the Indian and Spanish mixing, and because of the fundamental economic activity along this coastal region. And so going from the northern part of the country down to the Guayaquil Bay, individuals would live along the seashores in small towns or enclosures, even to this day. They fish in canoes or bongos, using cast nets and other devices. They go to sea at night or early in the morning. I had the opportunity to stay and spend some time in one of the port communities of Port called Puerto Lopez, which is a fishing community. And I had the opportunity of getting up at sunrise and going out to the beach and watching these little boats come in, loaded with fish and seafood of all kinds. The buyers were right there on the beach, and so were the cookers of food. It was so exciting to be able to see the motion and to be able to partake in some of the freshness where I bought right off of the beach. I got my courage up and made the deal and bought a few things to then go cook at my hostel on the time that I was there. But the choclo pescador, this would be their lifestyle. The fishing, of course, was central to that. The techniques that come from traditional ways to harvest the fish and shrimp. But as with the other groups, the importance of beauty, the importance of the craftsmanship. These are some of the tools that would be used by those fishermen even today. And a replica of the boats and the netting that they would use. Very simple, but effective. As I've had some opportunities to experience some of the communities here in Ecuador, one of the things that stands out to me is when they are fishing at this scale, that they're bringing in a harvest for today's sales. They're carrying in what they can carry in their boats. And it just seems like a lighter touch on the earth and the ocean. And the next group that I want to share with you about is the Montubio. And this is interior to the coastal area. And the habitation is dispersed throughout the mountains in this particular area. And they too would form towns on the banks of rivers or along roads. The dress would be very similar to other mestizo groups in the area, with light, simple clothing and a straw hat. Oftentimes, they would always be carrying a machete. The foods of this particular region that would be a part of their regular diet would be things like rice and cassava, yuca, same thing. The bananas, fruits, and hunting and fishing would also supplement their diets. Their main commerce would be agriculture. And in those regions, coffee, cacao, and bananas would be the crops. Those regions have also developed livestock farming, and the toquilla straw crafts come from this region. Oftentimes, people don't realize that what we call, or what people may know to be Panama hats, are actually straw hats coming from Ecuador. The story that I've heard is that one of our presidents many, many years ago was visiting the Panama Canal, and someone had one of those hats on. And from then on, they've been called Panama hats. But this particular region is the region where the Tokia straw crafts and textiles, both pottery and saddlery and furniture, would be products from these particular areas. The woven fibers made into hats and other products. You'll notice a little bit different style in the baskets. They too would be a culture that would pass down their stories from generation to generation. And even the woven crafts of things like beautiful slippers, colored fibers that would be woven into things, again, the beauty that was around in their life. And then carvings and statues, whether they be stone or wood. Some of the other cultures you saw gourds or coconut shells being used in a utilitarian way. And the hats. Ecuador and the hats. The next region that I'd like to share with you as we explore the museum a little bit further is the Otavalas region. Northern, more towards the central of the country. Ancient indigenous groups such as the Natabuela, the Karangil, the Kayambi, and the Otavala. They would settle in towns. The nuclear family was very important. In this particular region, agriculture would be their main economic push. Textiles, the traditional textiles are also still a very important trade. And it's an important trade not only within the country, but outside the country as well. In this particular region, you might find works in embroidery, wood, and leather. And oftentimes, the sashes and the blouses would be a reflection of that embroidery. The women would typically adorn themselves with necklaces, bracelets, ear cuffs, earrings, cloth around the head. And men would typically have short white pants and the espadrilles, blue and gray or red ponchos and cloth hats. These cloth hats, as you see here, I refrained from touching them because they looked like they might be felt. And then artifacts that show the mixture and the influence of Catholicism in the region. The adornment of the women would be beading and beautiful and colorful embroidery, embellishments. And then music, we talked about music being a part of the culture. And from flutes to harps to drums to fiddles, that these are a part of even contemporary culture of these people. And celebration. How could I not talk about celebration? One of the wonderful experience that I'm having is of the celebrations. All kinds of celebrations for all kinds of things. And sometimes I don't really understand what they're all about. But there's often sweet treats and fireworks. And at one of the events, one of the local Cuencanas shared with me that there's usually a spiritual celebration, but the secular pairs right alongside of that. And so individuals, whether they're Catholic or not, oftentimes participate in some of the festivities and celebrations, both of the religious celebrations, but also the cultural celebrations. The next group I'm going to share with you a little bit about is the Pichincha. And in this province, we find ethnic groups that are not very marked, the Kayambi and the Zambiza people. And they're very similar, perhaps, in culture to the Colorados or the Sachilas, who live in the warm valleys. The majority of the population for this group would be white mestizos, which would be a product of mixing Spanish with the indigenous conquerors. Representatives of this group would be the peasants of Chagra and Shula, Quiteria, which would be city dwellers. And the majority of them would be of ancestral roots would be of the mestizo population. This particular area is closer to the capital region of Quito. And this particular area, crafts and marzipan, crafts of wax and of wood would be typical. This is a relatively cool region with average temperatures around 55 degrees. It's located in the northern Sierra. And this area has quite a bit of history and value for archaeological and the architecture there, and the colonial art that still is there. This particular area has several ecological areas. And in this particular region, you've got the microclimates, including the low plains that have a tropical climate, and even some areas that have would be snowy. And so they have the range of climates there in this particular area. Some of the works, as you see, would be textiles, brightly colored. Bright colors and motifs of the fibers and the weavings, the shoes, the skirts, the sashes, and the ponchos, as well as those things that were ornamental for the home. The next region I want to talk to you about is the Cotopaxi region. We're coming a little bit further down into the country, into the central area. And there's various ethnic groups in this particular area and in this particular province. It would include groups like the Zumbahuas, the Tiguas, the Guangajes, and the Moritas. The festivals oftentimes are related to the agricultural calendar in this particular region and the religious observances and commemorations of Catholicism. Many indigenous people still to this day are within the Catholic system. And the holidays are oftentimes associated with that particular religious structure. The Christian holidays like Corpus Christi, which is one of the main communion days, and the festivities and the sweet treats that go on for days. The Black Mama, which is the Virgin of Mercy, and currently we're in Carnival, which will lead up to Lent. And so these cultures, these celebrations are part of the culture, as well as wood and paper crafts, clay, and the sashes are still being made by traditional techniques. And as you can see, some of the clothing, the weavings, the fibers, the skirts, oftentimes with a slight bit of embroidery from this particular region, a slight bit of embroidery along the bottom. These were some of the cultures that I explored. And then there was a part of the museum that I think is now my favorite part of the museum. And maybe you'll know why when I get done. But as you move through the museum and the cultural displays and you look at the artifacts and the wares, the jewelry and the pottery, the weavings and the beautiful things, I move into the area that is the area that talks about the spiritual. This is the entrance as it gives some insight into some of the traditions that involve their spiritual life. The Sankram says, no Shuar is the owner of life. For which reason should he for which reason he should not kill. Their beliefs include punishment for those who take the lives of others, however. The rights of the Sansa maintain the social equilibrium by punishing the crime of murder, unjustified murder. Today, it's done by law. But as we weave through this area of the museum, I'll share with you about some of these ancient times. As this continues, upon being found guilty of an unjust death, with the help of the shaman, the family would prepare the Sangkum, or the warrior. And he would search for the authorization of Artun in the waterfalls. They would seek out the spirits to see if this was an unjust death and if it needed to be vindicated. Upon receiving permission from the spirit, the ritual bracelet was put on and the attack against the enemy was planned. The myth of the Ayapum guided all of the steps to be followed. And so even the steps of justice were steps that were connected with the spiritual. As they went to war, they would search out the person that had committed the unjust killing. And as they did that, the researchers have come up with two possible scenarios for why this was happening. This custom would have been a custom that many have heard of with the shrunken heads, but they may not understand the background. And so I wanted to share that as a way of sharing some of their spiritual actions that they believed helped to maintain the cosmic balance. And so there's two hypotheses about the shrunken heads. One is that it's an exchange of souls, and that by killing the murderer, his spirit was sent into limbo in which his victim was found. That there was a transfer of power of the deceased to the killer, the avenger, who became imbued with the power of the dead enemy. They think that this was the exchange in the spiritual realm, in the cosmic realm, of being able to right the wrong of an unjust killing. And so I just wanted to share some of that as I share with you a little bit more about the ritual, a little bit more about the understanding of this particular tradition. Once the warrior went out, the warrior would take the life of the murderer. But they would immediately go and hide for fear of retaliation. And they would begin the process of preparing the head. They would give prayers and they would sing the spiritual songs, because this was not revenge. This was a spiritual work, they felt, of maintaining that cosmic balance. And so this was not something that was done just out of spite. It was done because this was what they believed they were called to do in the spiritual realm. They would pray, they would sing the spiritual songs, and this was a solemn time as they made the preparations. They would then use quills from an animal, similar to a needle, and they would close the mouth during this time. The warriors, after they made the preparations, would fast. They would breathe in the sacred tobacco smoke. They would consume other of the indigenous medicines, and we now know those had some sort of hallucinogenic effects. They would go and make the preparations as they sang and as they carried out these rituals in a state of fasting. They made a very clear distinction that this would not be done. This punishment would not be served to children or women, nor the Apache, who they considered to be inferior beings. And as they prepared as they would go into the next year, there would be a time after the year had passed that they would consider that killing to have been avenged. The warrior would return to the village. There would be a time, a spiritual time, that would close that period of time, this time for this process to end. And at the ending of this time, they would remove the spines that had closed the mouth, and that was so that the spirit of that person would not be released. And they would replace it with cotton or some sort of fiber to be able to close that mouth. I thought about this, and I thought about the meaning behind it. This last picture, as you see, that has been the ritual has been outlawed, but they still symbolically carry out these traditions using the sloth. And as modernity has taken place, they use this is just a ritual practice, and we have laws and things like that that now govern those kinds of behaviors. It was interesting to me, though, however, that the individuals and the family would first seek out spiritual guidance. They would seek out guidance to make sure that this was a killing that needed to be avenged. And they felt like this was a way for the scales to be balanced in a karmic kind of way.
I find it interesting because Catholicism is so strong that this is a whole other, like, here's Catholicism, and then there's like this, like, because yes. It was back then, it was still strong. I'm sure it was still taking over. It's just kind of interesting.
Very different than the practices, perhaps, of Catholicism. Mm-hmm. But these were the indigenous ways that they maintained the balances in their community. Mm-hmm. In addition to the exhibits, and I couldn't show you all of the things, Christina and I chatted earlier about all of the pictures that I took and some of the other cultures and some of the other artifacts. In addition to that, there are the archaeological areas and gardens around the museum. The museum also has other displays that are going on. There was a lovely display by Mexican artists that were reflecting on the revolution and liberation work of indigenous people. There were several other art exhibits that were on display there. But what I shared with you is part of their permanent exhibit there in the museum. In addition to that, there's a theater where there are regular productions with music and art. And so I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share this with you, to share a little bit about the diverse culture of Cuenca as I too am learning more and more about it. And so I thank you for taking the time and going on this field trip with me. And I'll open up the floor if there are questions that I may be able to answer for you, or any other tidbit of information that you might like to have. But thank you for going along. You guys were great going along with the field trip today. And I want to thank you for joining me from Cuenca, Ecuador, to learn more about the culture here. Any questions that I can field from the group today?
I'll say, Sandra said, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining in today. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Right. Georgina put in the chat, do they have indigenous people?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So like still.
And it's very interesting. One of my observations is that we still have visibly the Cuenca community. Cuenca is a very large city, about 500,000 people. And even in today's time, you see the interweaving of the contemporary Ecuadorians and the indigenous people. The indigenous people still wear their wares, just like you saw in some of these pictures. They'll have the skirts, they'll have the shawls and the ponchos and the hats. It's obvious that they're from different regions because oftentimes the skirts are very different from one region to another. But this community is very much a weaving of both the old and the new coexisting together in a way that really is beautiful and really does enrich my life. So, yes, they're a very integral part of the community. Um, the involvement in the community, the food and the ways and the wares of the community. We're still able to go and find many of these woven products, baskets and rugs, bowls, carved bowls, and utilitarian items for your home, from spoons to rugs, um, furniture, jewelry, pottery. So there's quite a bit of integration of both the old and the new. What's the weather like? Well, I live in Cuenca. Cuenca is known to be in the state of perpetual spring. It's on average 70 to 75 degrees every day year round with low temperatures about 50. And I love it. I love it. Some days the what do you call it? The rays are a little bit high. The levels, they have the levels, UV levels. So some days they're high, but it's a very pleasant temperature where flowers are in bloom all year round. They are not still practicing the shrunken heads. It has now been deemed illegal. They do ceremonially still practice the tradition with the sloths. That last picture was the shrunken sloth instead of that. And so now murders would be avenged by the legal system and not by the indigenous ways. So they have outlawed that particular practice. Any other questions this evening?
I know it's interesting. I remember you posted pictures before of the shrunken heads, and I was looking at it. I remember that stuff from the cartoons growing up and as a kid, seeing the little cartoon. And I was like, I am actually looking at somebody's head. And then it was like somebody died and they have no clue that their head would transcend many
It's a
generations.
it's a somber moment,
It
watching that. And one of the things that they said was that as um, the conquests happened, that those that were not indigenous people, um, became like what's the word? You know how we do things commercialized.
right, yes.
And so some of the spiritual importance or significance of this, I think, may have been skewed. And part of what this display does is to be able to explain the spiritual practices, explain the reasons behind. And I was really um, grateful to have an understanding and to understand the connection with this being spiritual work that's led by the shamans there in their community. The shamans who were there to be able to hold communities in balance. And this was one of the ways that the indigenous people did that. Coca leaf. The coca leaf is still used today. It's very beneficial, medicinal. It's a leaf, but it's a very medicinal tea, especially for altitude sickness. I live at a little over 8,000 feet. Quito is a little over 9,000 feet, and the altitude at those heights can be a problem. And so, coca leaves are used as a tea. Cannot bring them back to the United States, from what I understand, but they're also used as a cleansing herb in spiritual practices. Very similar to what you may see someone using sage or burning a Palo Santo or something like that in that order. And so the coca leaf is something that would be part of the spiritual practices, but also part of the tea, a part of natural healing. And so that's one of the things that's significant for altitude sickness. So still lots of coca leaves. The weavings, yes. Um, I've gone and watched the hat makers, some of the ladies that may be working on the hats, the weaving and the fibers. Some of the hats are just amazingly beautiful here, colorful, with the dyed fibers and intricate design patterns designed into the Panama hats, air quotes, the Panama hats. Um, but definitely very, very um, very beautiful work in the carvings, in pottery, in many other crafts. What I really enjoy about the region is the craftsmanship. This is an area where there are makers of all kinds, makers of all kinds of things. Here in Cuenca, the beauty of art, the murals that are everywhere. So I'm really grateful to be in this community and to be sharing. And thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Thank you for taking the time out to let us share some of the diversity of culture. I truly believe that being able to find our points of connection, that this is how we do it, that if it's nothing but being able to admire the beauty and to be able to share in that with these cultures, but to be able to understand more about the people and the simplicity of their life, but also the richness of it. And so thank you for joining me this evening. Please stay tuned to Atlantic Institute and all of the wonderful creations that are there. Thank you for joining from all over and giving us this time. You guys were great on the field trip. You guys didn't touch any of the artifacts. You guys were a great field trip group. I look forward to taking you guys along on some more field trips in the future. I think there's a one on Panama hats coming up soon where we're going to the museum, the Hat Museum, and we might even make it to one of the production locations and be able to see some of that in motion. So definitely stay tuned to the calendar of events for Atlantic Institute. Christine, do you have any final parting words as we?
I think I would have touched. I think I might have touched that one hat just because those other hats were all woven, and that one was not. And it was kind of interesting to see one that was not woven because
I
the
wasn't sure
style
if it
and
was leather or felt. It
yeah, because
looked
it
on the
looked.
surface like it might be felt, but then when I looked at the edge of it, it looked like it might be leather. I resisted. I resisted. I resisted.
I know you did good because I mean it looked to me like that moleskin, like that you get that those patches that go on your skin like that moleskin type of.
On the surface, that's what it kind of looked like. And yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, there was not anything on there that could show me um what the
Yeah,
fabric was. There was
what it
no
was. Yeah,
marker there to tell me
yeah,
what kind of fabric that particular hat was.
yeah.
So it will just be a mystery in my own mind. I'm torn between felt and leather, or maybe leather covered, felt covered leather. I don't really know, but
All
beautiful,
right.
beautiful, beautiful displays there.
Thank you all.
Henry,
Uh,
bye. Thank you all for coming. Have a great evening.
then you can hit